You must love podcasts if you're listening to this. Do you want to start your own one or you already have one? Then follow Smarter Podcasting to get expert advice from me, Niall Mackay, the podcast guy. Since 2019, we've worked with over 40 podcasters, produced over 700 episodes, and helped many podcasts get to the top of the Apple Podcast charts. And right now, I'm offering you a professional edit for just $27. Click the link in the show notes. Podcasting does have a really low barrier to entry, and at its most basic form, you don't need to spend a lot of money. Get yourself a dynamic microphone, get yourself a pair of headphones if you don't already have them, make good content, make it something that you love, and then just watch the audience grow from there. Welcome to another episode of Smarter Podcasting with me, your host, Niall Mackay, the podcast guy. I started my first podcast as a hobby in 2019 because I was bored and I loved podcasts. That podcast has now gone on to be in the top 10% of podcasts worldwide, and it's my baby and I absolutely love it. It's called A Vietnam Podcast. But I started this podcast to help people like yourself build your own podcast from nothing, and that's what today's episode is going to be about. I created the business 7 Million Bikes podcast, and we've now helped over 50 podcasts around the world, produced over 700 episodes, helped with millions of downloads, and helped podcasts get to the top of the podcast charts as well. And so in this episode, I want to share with you why you should start a podcast in 2025 if you haven't already. And I assume if you're listening to this, you have, but maybe you've stumbled across this podcast because you're thinking about it and you think, this is it, this is a year I should start a podcast. Number one, you should do it because it's fun and it's amazing. I honestly can't tell you the connections that I've made, the people that I've met, the opportunities that I've had because I started a podcast. And it's growing quickly as well. Now, over 60% of people in the world have listened to a podcast at least once a month. That's crazy. And don't let anyone tell you that there's too many podcasts. You may have heard this already. I heard it just recently. They're like, oh, I can't choose. There's too many. I have never once in my life heard anyone say that there's too many shows on Netflix, that there's too much TV, that we need to stop making movies. If you compare it to these mediums or blogs or websites, podcasts has only just started to scratch the surface and become mainstream. And in fact, as we come out of 2024, we've just had what's called by many people the podcast election, where podcasts shaped who became the president of the United States of America. So podcasting is going nowhere. And now is the time to start one if you haven't already, or if you do have a podcast, to take it to the next level. One of the biggest barriers to people starting their own podcast is because of the equipment needed to start their own show. And one of the beautiful things about podcasting is it does have a really low barrier to entry. And at its most basic form, you could record a podcast on the microphone on your phone and then publish it really easily, really simply. It might not be the best final product, but you can do it. I don't actually recommend that because I want to make the best podcast possible, but it is that easy to start a podcast. The video that I've just produced that is part of what you're watching right now is how easy it can be and how little equipment is needed to set up a podcast and how you don't even need the proper space to do it. I'm recording right now in one of the meeting rooms in my buildings that I rented for a couple of hours. It's honestly probably one of the worst locations outside of on a highway or next to a busy motorway. It's one of the worst locations that you could record a podcast in. One of the things I learned really early on from my good friend Lewis Wright, who's helped everything I've done since I started podcasting, is about the sound and how to make the sound better. And he showed me something really simple, and it's just the clap test. Hey, the clap like that. I know what you're thinking. When you clap in any room, you'll be able to hear the echo of that noise. And if there is an echo, it means it's not great sound. It means the sound vibrations will bounce off of all the walls and the mirrors and the windows and the floors. And that's why a really expensive podcast studio, it will be carpeted. It has acoustic panels built into the walls and the ceilings. And if you clap your hands, it will just be a dead, muffled sound. I remember I went to visit Lewis Wright at his recording studio. He worked for a professional music production company here in Saigon, and I walked into his studio and there was literally no noise, like no background noise, no nothing. It was dead silence. And I was in there for about, I think, 1 or 2 minutes. I was like, Lewis, I need to get out of here. I feel sick. And he's like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. That's really normal in the beginning because there's no sound. Your brain is not used to not hearing anything. And that's for super professional recording situations where you're producing really professional music. I don't have a professional studio yet. I'm going to get one soon. But in the meantime, I record wherever and whenever I can. And I've moved about a lot lately as I'm trying to find the right spot. If you go back and check out my last video, this was a test in itself. And from a quick look at the results from that last video, the results were pretty good. And one of the reasons is the equipment that I'm using, and you don't need to spend a lot. I started off with a Blue Yeti condenser microphone, and I tell everyone, don't do that. Get a dynamic microphone. You don't need to spend a lot of money, but get any dynamic microphone. It means it only picks up the sound in front of you. You can get them for probably less than $50. And during the pandemic, I was using a headset that I found in the house to record online. I didn't realize till months later when I looked it up, it was actually a $10 headset. It wasn't perfect, but it did the job. So don't stress too much about the equipment you need. Get yourself a dynamic microphone. Get yourself a pair of headphones if you don't already have them. Everything these days can be plugged in via USB. I use a PodTrack P4, which lets me use an XLR cable, which gives a little bit more quality. But just get started with USB. I assume most people have a computer these days. Plug it into your computer and get recording. The other thing, as you may be watching this on YouTube right now, is do you need video? In 2025, the short answer is yes. Now, video adds more equipment, more editing time, and more cost, essentially, and time to making a podcast. But in 2025, it is completely worth it. So I did some videos on Zoom before. They were pretty terrible, but some of them got some good views. Then I started using my iPhone. I used the 4K camera on that, and that was incredible as well. You get 4K footage from your iPhone. Just remember, if you have any recent model of Samsung or Apple or Oppo or whatever brand, the camera on there is going to be better than probably anything 5-10 years ago. So just remember, you have a supercomputer, a super camera on your phone, and you can use them as well. Get yourself like a cheap tripod, or look, even just lean it up against a book. Anything that you need to do. I have finagled so many things to make sure that I can have a good episode. And you won't believe it right now, the camera I'm using right now, I've just upgraded recently to the Osmo Pocket 3, which is more for vlogging and taking around, but it has incredible footage, so I'm using it today. That right now is on top of a microphone box because it was too low, and I was like, how can I make it higher? I didn't want to go back and get my tripod, so I just propped it up on a box. The more you do podcasting, the more you figure out these little things that can help produce quality episodes. So do you need video? No, but should you do video? Yes, especially in 2025. Do you need a lot of equipment, a lot of expensive equipment? Do you need a studio with acoustic sound panels renting out for hundreds of dollars an hour? No, you can just get started and get the basic equipment and start making a podcast now. Honestly, it will be worth it. Another big barrier to starting a podcast is one thing that a lot of people think is, who's going to listen to this? And just don't let those self-defeating thoughts hold you back, because we all think that. Even after I've been doing this for 5 years, I've done three of my own podcasts. I've made several others. I still ask myself this. Even right now, as I'm recording this, I'm thinking, who's listening to this? And to be honest, even if it's one person, does it matter? That is incredible. As I said right at the beginning, do it because you love it. And then don't worry about the audience. I found that they come, and every single person is unique in their own way. One of my favorite comedians, Bill Hicks, says that just be yourself and nobody else can be you. And I remember that all the time. Even recently, I was looking at another podcaster, another YouTuber, and I was thinking, wow, they're amazing. What can I do differently? And then I reminded myself, just be yourself, be you, and somebody will connect with that, and people will want to hear from what you have to say. So don't worry about building an audience. Not everyone's going to be the next Joe Rogan. Not everybody wants to be the next Joe Rogan. But you can build an audience that will follow you and will listen to you and will connect with you. So don't worry about building an audience. Just get podcasting and then be consistent. Post regularly. Post everywhere you can. Share it with friends and family. Make it great. Make good content. Make it something that you love, and then just watch the audience grow from there. Now, along with posting consistently, one of the most important tips that I can give you that you will read about consistently is being consistent with your content. So that means choose a day, and honestly, it doesn't matter what day it is. It doesn't matter what time it is, but just choose a day and a time and publish regularly, whether that's once a month, once every 2 weeks, or ideally once a week. If you really want to build an audience, just choose that same time and date and publish consistently there so your audience know when you will be available. So your audience knows when your podcast is going to be out. And the other big tip, and I cannot stress this enough, is choose your niche and make your niche something that you're really passionate about, because honestly, there is an audience out there for everyone and everything. I didn't think anyone would listen to my podcast about me talking about life in Vietnam. And as I said, it's taken off and it's pretty well known now in Vietnam. And I think it might be the longest running English language podcast in Vietnam as well. So choose something that you're passionate about, something that you want to talk about. And it doesn't matter what it is. It honestly can be anything. We produced a knitting podcast last year, and it was about crafts. And for me, as a guy who does not do crafts, you might think nobody's going to be interested in that. But then you realize so many people are interested in that. We've made accounting podcasts. We've made podcasts about creativity. Everything has their audience. The biggest tip I can give is choose your niche and then make it as niche as possible. The best example of that is a podcast I love called Aged Like Milk. And it's a movie review podcast. These guys all live in LA. They love movies. They love talking about movies. And what that podcast is about is they look at old movies and then look at it with a lens of today's lens and say, has it aged like milk? Does it stand the test of time? And I love that it's not just a podcast of three people saying, hey, we all love movies. Let's just chat about movies. And this is the biggest tip. Don't do your podcast about everything and anything. If you do that, it's about nothing. And the amount of people I hear or I speak to, they say, oh, I'm just going to do a podcast about everything and anything. Go right now. Go to Spotify or Apple Podcasts, type in everything and anything or anything and everything, and you will see hundreds, if not thousands of other podcasts with the same name, all with the same concept. How are you going to stand out if you do that? And then one of the biggest questions I get is, how do I promote my podcast? And it's the key. It's a big question that we all wonder. There are several ways. The two ways are organic or non-organic. So do you want to pay for ads or do you not want to pay for ads? Most people don't want to pay for ads in the beginning. And that's what I'm like, and that's what I'm still like. If you don't want to pay for ads, this is where video becomes really, really crucial. You want to create videos, like short form content videos that you can publish on LinkedIn, on Instagram, Facebook, and most of all, YouTube as well. Those short videos, which take a 30 to 60 second clip of your hour-long podcast, will, in my experience, do anything up to 1,000 to 10,000 times better than the actual podcast itself. And if at the end of the day, your goal is to build your podcast, build your brand, get people in front of you and in front of your podcast, the best way to do that is with short-form content. And you may read some blogs, you may be given some advice to where they say, if you don't do video, then do audiograms, which is basically like a moving image on the screen with the words up and then obviously the words in the background if you've got sound on. I've tried that. They perform so badly. None of the platforms want to push that. None of the platforms want to push that content. And remember, you're at the whim of the platform. You upload an audiogram with just some moving images and text, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. They're not going to show it to anybody, and people who find it aren't going to watch it. And if the audience isn't watching it, they'll show it even less. So really invest some time and energy into creating short form content and getting that out there. I've just done an episode with Guang Jin as well, a massive podcaster based in Singapore, and he's explained how they've created a feedback loop where they have podcasts on YouTube and then it sends listeners back to their podcast. So one of the biggest ways that you can build your audience is, unfortunately, whether you like it or not, get on YouTube. And that's going to be my biggest tip. And I've done some episodes about it recently. I'm really excited about YouTube. I was anti-video for the longest time. I was an audio-only guy. I like getting in front of a microphone. I like not worrying about how my hair looked, how the lighting is. Have I pressed record on the camera? I have pressed record. Now that has definitely happened to me before. So I was anti-video for the longest time. And then over the last 6 months, I've really gotten into video. I really like it. I've become accustomed to seeing myself on camera. I'm already accustomed to hearing my voice. So now I'm getting used to what I look like. I still make mistakes. I still don't have the lighting on right, or I have the wrong setting on the camera. I've had cameras, I was using my iPhone to record before and it overheated and just stopped recording in the middle of it. I had another episode where I ran out of storage on the phone and it stopped recording. But, these are things that independent podcasters like me and you just have to suffer. And I am still an independent podcaster. I do run a podcast production company, but myself, this is just me. There's nobody behind this camera right now. There's no one else in this room. I don't have a producer. I have an editor, but that's about it. So I would say be prepared to make mistakes, and I'll share them with you. Make mistakes, mess them up, but just do it, get into it. And I always say, even to my team as well, just always aim to be 1% better. And nobody can start perfect. And I know that holds a lot of people back because you want to start with the best product possible. You want to start perfectly. I think it's a trait that I actually have that is quite good, that I am prepared to just put myself out there and I'm prepared to do things badly. And when you go back and look at some of my early episodes, the video quality is awful, the lighting's terrible. So I've made mistakes. Even recently, last week, I did an episode where afterwards, the episode with Guang Jin, go and listen to it. I have to do a disclaimer at the beginning. The microphone wasn't connected properly, and I think it was the sound coming through. The microphone was recording from the computer, so my audio was terrible. And here's me, award-winning podcaster, trying to tell people how to make the best podcast possible, and my microphone wasn't even connected properly. So we all make mistakes, unless you're working for a massive big podcast production network or company. And you probably know the podcast I'm talking about, where you listen to it and at the end, the credits reel off and it's like our senior producer was this, our junior producer, our editor, our fact checker, and they list off 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people just to make one podcast. You're probably more like me. You're on your own. Don't worry about it. You can still make the best podcast possible. And so to sum it up, my biggest tip is get on YouTube. Get your podcast on YouTube. Get your shorts on there. Build your YouTube content, and it will help your audio as well. And so don't give up on audio. I'm never going to give up on audio. I love my RSS feed. I love having it on Apple Podcasts, and I love having it on Spotify. And I love people being able to listen to this podcast and all my podcasts wherever they are, whether they're in the gym or they're doing the laundry or they're doing the dishes, which is what I was doing when I decided to start my first podcast back in 2019. But if you are really serious about building your audience, then I would get on YouTube. So if you have any questions, then get in touch. The link will be in the show notes, or you can send me an email, neil@7millionbikes.com. If you're interested in starting your podcast, but you need some help with editing or production, guest management, anything like that, then 7 Million Bikes Podcast can help you with all of that. So get in touch. I'd love to have a chat with you. I give a free discovery call to everybody who wants to learn more about working with 7 Million Bikes and how we can do that. So I hope to hear from you soon. I hope this episode helped, and I'm looking forward to sharing more of my tips and tricks on how to make the best podcast possible and inviting on some of the biggest names in podcasts as well. So thanks again. Cheers.
Hi, my name is Sal Jeffries. I run the Mindset, Mood and Movement podcasts. I've been working with Neil at 7 Million Bikes for the whole of this year, literally from the start of my podcast to date. And I want to say a couple of things. So when we record the podcast, sometimes there are things that I need tweaking. There could be edits or clips. It's really simple. I give those instructions to Neil, he gets it sorted. There's sometimes a sound level differences between the guest mic and mine. Again, that's all sorted so the outcome is a really balanced sound. And also if there are issues with voice, little kind of sound interruptions, all those things that can distract a listener, Neil knows exactly what to do, cleans it up. The end result, highly professional, beautiful sounding podcast without distraction. That's exactly what I want. I know my listeners do. So if you're interested in having that level of podcast and that kind of quality, Neil is a great guy and I highly recommend you speak to him.